Support for WABE comes from Capital Good Fund, introducing Georgia Bright Solar Lease Program, a new rooftop solar initiative designed to create pathways to equitable and inclusive solar, sustainability, and monthly savings for Georgians. Learn more at georgiabright.org.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
It is now up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those in our party and beyond it who did not support him. And I hope he does that.
Former President Trump's last Republican challenger, Nikki Haley, bows out of the race ahead of Georgia's presidential primary on Tuesday.
So the 2024 presidential campaign is turning to the general election, with Trump and President Joe Biden holding competing rallies in Georgia on Saturday.
November 5th is going to go down as the single most important day in the history of our country.
American democracy. That's what the 2024 election is all about.
The weekend campaigning follows a busy qualifying week at the state legislature, where local and state candidates line up to pay their fees and register to run for office.
I didn't think it would be as exciting, but it turns out the second time it's still a charm, and I'm really excited.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm politics reporter Sam Gringlas. It's week 9 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is a special elections episode from Dome Scramble, a podcast about the legislature and more from WABE News in Atlanta. So, Sam, hello from one of my favorite places at the Capitol. I am sitting outside on the south steps that face the main legislative building. I love doing the podcast here. I love doing my closer look appearances here once the weather turns nice enough. And, well, the weather has finally turned nice enough.
All right, but before we get to the nice weather, let me rewind a couple days to a very rainy day here in Atlanta. This was earlier this week, and we had a special guest at the Capitol, along with Pastor of the Day. We got Doctor of the Day, and sitting in the Senate chamber, I knew the doctor who was up there, and I think you do too.
It was my wife. Dr. Dhruti Contractor was the Doctor of the Day on Tuesday, and I actually spent the morning hanging out with her. It was actually kind of a crazy experience for me because I went places I don't normally get to go. I mean, she got to go to the governor's office for an official picture. She got to meet the lieutenant governor, the speaker. You were in the Senate. She gave a short speech in the Senate. And then she got to man the medical clinic on the second floor of the state capitol. A lot of people don't realize that there's a full clinic in there. And I thought I was just going to get to hang out with her all day. Instead, she was busy all day with patient after patient. And here's my favorite story. State Representative Michelle Au and my wife have operated together, but they never made the connection because, well, my wife didn't take my last name. So they made the connection finally. So I do want to say thank you to everyone here. That was so nice to her. It was really, really appreciated. So, Sam, you know, it's been a busy week here at the state capitol, really kind of setting the agenda for the 2024 elections. Super Tuesday was this week. We had qualifying here at the state capitol. And Sam, you're going to be on duty this weekend. Tell the folks what you're doing Saturday.
Yeah, this week really feels like a kickoff to the general election. You know, Nikki Haley is out of the race on the Republican side, and so we are increasingly going to see Trump and Biden zeroing in on each other in this general election November matchup. And I think that will be really clearly illustrated on Saturday when both candidates are in Georgia rallying, you know, almost at exactly the same time in this kind of split screen stance. President Biden will be here in Atlanta rallying supporters, and former President Trump will be in North Georgia, a reliably conservative part of the state, rallying his base in downtown Rome. And I think we can start to see some of the dynamics that we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of months play out. We're going to see President Biden looking to shore up support among younger voters, among people of color, his base coalition, Trump trying to fire up more rural white Republicans in parts of the state outside of Atlanta, and both eventually are going to need to compete for these suburban, more independently minded voters that have been really crucial in Georgia in the past elections.
Now, it's important to remind people that we still have the presidential primary for Georgia this coming Tuesday, and I want to explain how that works. Georgia has open primaries, so you go to your polling place and can ask either for a Republican or a Democratic ballot. On the Republican side, there are 59 delegates at stake, and what we mean is these are the 59 nominating delegates for the presidential nominations for the Republican side. 17 are statewide delegates, 42 are based on congressional districts. 14 districts, 3 per district, that's how you get to 42. The districts are winner take all when a candidate exceeds 50%. On the Democrat side, you've got 123 delegates from Georgia. Now, there's something interesting going on with that primary, and that has to do with this idea of Democrats pulling a ballot, but then leaving them blank. Sam, tell me about it.
Organizers are calling this the Leave It Blank campaign, and they're modeling it after efforts in earlier primary states, most notably Michigan, to send a message to President Biden about his stance on the war in Gaza. I attended a press conference earlier this week, and one of the people I met was Rada Najjar. She helped organize Arab Americans for Biden back in 2020, but since then, she's lost 75 relatives, she says, in Gaza since that war began. And so now she's helped refashion that group, Arab Americans for Biden, into Arab Americans Forward.
Even if we only register 1,200 blank votes, which is 10% of President Biden's margin of victory in Georgia, we can still send a powerful message that President Biden must earn our vote through an immediate and significant change in his policy.
That similar campaign in Michigan drew more than 100,000 uncommitted votes.
So bringing it back to Georgia, more than 350,000 people have already voted early in Georgia's primary. About 240,000 of those have pulled a Republican ballot, while about 120,000 have pulled a Democratic ballot. Now, looking at the ballots, on the Republican side, you've got 11 names because those ballots were set back in November. Nikki Haley being one of those still in the ballots. Sam, you covered Nikki Haley in South Carolina. Over the past few years, you've talked to so many independent voters in the Atlanta suburbs and in Georgia. I think the key question is, what are these voters going to do?
Exactly. Haley was getting 30-40% of the vote in some GOP primaries so far. And the question is, do these voters come around to Trump? Do they vote for Biden in November, or do they stay home? And when we talk about these voters, I often think of Atlanta's suburbs, as you mentioned, where I met so many Republicans over the last few years who have soured on Trump, don't want Biden, and in the last election, in the midterms, split their votes between Brian Kemp and Raphael Warnock. We heard Haley at the top of the show saying Trump needs to convince her voters to join his fold, but Trump responded later that day saying he doesn't really need too many of them. Just last month, I met Georgia voter Jennifer Michael at a rally for Nikki Haley in North Augusta, South Carolina. She's a Georgia voter, but had crossed the border to South Carolina to hear from Haley, and this is what she told me about her plan for Georgia's primary.
Her name is already on our ballot, so I can vote for her whether she's still running or not, and that will be what I will do.
I will be very curious to see how many people follow Jennifer Michael's lead and still select Nikki Haley or someone else on the Republican ballot on Tuesday, and that could give us some clues about the amount of work that Trump or Biden have to do to convince these very important swing voters to come to their side before November.
Now, before we move on, Sam, I want to talk about another very important group of voters that we have talked about throughout the years. Some reporting you've got coming out on black voters in swing states. black voter turnout declined nationwide between the last two midterms. Georgia's drop-off was smaller than other swing states, but strategists are warning that a similar decline in black voter turnout from 2020 could be disastrous for Democrats. Talk about that, Sam.
That's right. So at the end of last year, I got a report that grabbed my attention. It was written by Democratic strategists in both Georgia and Michigan. And as we all know, these are my two states. Obviously live in Georgia now. I'm from Michigan. So that immediately caught my attention. But the report offered some really interesting analysis and some potential lessons for 2024. One thing that jumped out to me was that Georgia retained about 90% of black voters. So 90% of black voters who voted in the 2018 midterm came back in 2022. But if you break those numbers down, there were big drops in voters under 40 specifically. I recently met up with some of the authors of this report at Cascade Skating in Atlanta. It's this well-loved roller rink on Atlanta's west side with neon signs and funky carpet. Strategist Dean Anthony told me this is the kind of place that candidates need to campaign in, and he said that outreach has to be both early and often.
The black community is hit 3-4 weeks before the actual election day, and everybody's asking what happened. It is not on the black community to save America, but it is right for anyone who is expecting this community's vote to be intentional about caring for it.
I talked to one voter who was unlacing his roller skates. His name was Marcus Allen, and he told me he hasn't voted since Obama in 2008.
You have heard a lot of candidates say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But when they get in the office, they don't do that. Like downtown, the streets, the potholes and everything, they need to be fixed. Over the years, they said they're going to do it, but it never happened.
Marcus Allen's top issue is raising the minimum wage. He says he works a lot, but is still just getting by. And so, conversations like this really underscore the point that it will be really important for candidates to go to places perhaps outside of their normal tried and true spots to reach these non-voters, irregular voters, and try and bring them into the fold before November.
Now, before we go, I do have one important follow-up question. Did you go skating, Sam?
I plead the fifth. No, I didn't go skating. I can ice skate. I cannot roller skate. So I did not strap on any skates for this reporting assignment.
Well, as someone who can't skate or ice skate, I'm not going to say anything here. What I will say is let's take a break here. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
The field of mental health counseling is growing rapidly, and Richmont Graduate University can equip you with everything you need as a licensed professional counselor while integrating your faith into your clinical practice. Programs are offered in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and online. Apply today at richmont.edu. That's richmont.edu.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. All right, let's stick with elections for a moment, but I want to turn to local and state races and qualifying week. Rahul, this is kind of an emotional moment. Set the scene for me.
So this is like one of the most fun and crazy weeks at the Capitol because we're still actually in session. Lawmakers are still meeting, but they're also having to go down to the second floor of the state Capitol and go into the Republican room or the Democratic room and put their money down and say, here's what I'm running for, and file their paperwork. I mean, Monday, so little got done because, well, everybody was so busy qualifying, and it was going really, really slow. But here's the thing. You get these moments, these interesting images and moments, and let me share a couple that I witnessed personally. In the Democratic qualifying room, there were 4 members of Congress in there at the same time for qualifying. Sanford Bishop, Hank Johnson, Lucy McMath, Nikema Williams. Then across the way in the Republican line for the qualifying room, you had a state lawmaker who's next to a candidate in a marijuana outfit. And then I saw two members of Congress next to each other. One of them was Rich McCormick, dressed in this impeccable suit, while Austin Scott is in jeans and this chill cotton shirt. So, I mean, just this wider range of people in line. And some of the folks were there with their families, kids, parents, spouses, people taking pictures on the south steps of the Capitol. Some of them looked like they were doing like a glamour shots deal. I mean, it's just so much going on. But one of my favorite conversations was with State Representative Pedro Marin. He's a Democrat from Gwinnett County who's leaving after 22 years in the legislature.
I have qualified, 11 terms, 11 times. So I'm excited not to have to do the line, not to qualify, not to do campaign, fundraising, so I'm a little relaxed.
Now, here's the funniest part of that whole conversation. At the time we did the interview, no one had qualified, and no one had told him they were qualifying for a seat. So he actually had a check ready to go, and he had his paperwork filled out in case no one qualified to run, or a Democrat didn't qualify to run for a seat. But someone did, and he will ride off into the sunset.
Rahul, that is absolutely wild. I love that. By the way, while we're still talking about qualifying week, some developments from my end of the world. Both Fulton Superior Judge Scott McAfee and District Attorney Fulton Willis both qualified to run again in 2024. Rahul, you and some other reporters had a quick interview with Willis, and she was asked about the possibility of facing a challenger.
This is a democracy we live in, right? And so people have a right to run for office, but they should come prepared for a fight. They should know that my heart is still in this work. My heart will continue to be in this work, and I intend to be the DA for the next 4 years and 9 months.
Now, as of the taping of this podcast, nobody on either side of the political aisle has qualified to run against Willis. Now, I want to mention one interesting dynamic when we interviewed her. Willis came to the Capitol on Wednesday, about 2 hours after a state Senate committee investigating her held a hearing. This is as she's facing allegations of a conflict of interest in the Georgia election interference case. Now, I did ask her if she was going to appear before that committee, and she said she would consult her lawyer about it.
Yeah, I covered that hearing, and while it was a lot more cordial and focused than most congressional hearings typically are, my takeaway is that it didn't turn up anything new.
Now, one of the key pieces of legislation that did pass here at the state legislature had to do with implementing the Prosecuting Attorney's Qualification Commission. It had run into some procedural issues, and Senate Bill 332 fixes those. Now, this commission could be used to investigate, discipline, or even remove Willis. That bill now is headed to the governor's desk.
Meanwhile, we are still anxiously awaiting a decision from Judge McAfee in the next week or so on whether Willis should be disqualified from the Trump prosecution.
Now, I want to mention one other interesting election story, kind of a weird election story, and that's the drama around the Public Service Commission races that are not qualifying here this week at the state capitol. Let's start off by talking about what the Public Service Commission is and does. It's a 5-member commission that oversees a number of utilities in the state. The most high profile of these is Georgia Power, including regulating how the company makes power and what rates it charges. Now, what was at issue and is still at issue is the election structure. Its 5 members have to live in one of 5 districts, but they're elected on a statewide basis. What that has meant in recent years is that the commission is all Republican. 2006, 2007, that was the last time a Democrat was even on the commission. Then a few years ago, there was a lawsuit arguing that the election structure illegally diluted the power of black voters because there was no way black voters could elect a candidate of their choice. And the argument was that Georgia should have a format like it elects members of Congress. They have congressional districts, and they get elected by the voters in those districts. In 2022, a federal judge agreed and basically canceled the elections of 2 members, Republicans Tim Echols and Fitz Johnson. Then a different group of federal judges overturned that ruling, saying Georgia had a right to pick its format for elections and that there was no evidence that race was a factor in picking the format, the current format for the Public Service Commission. But Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger told me he's still waiting for final orders.
There's a lot of moving parts on that, but I don't want to get into conjectures and making predictions. It's in his bailiwick. He's got to make a decision. And once he does, then we'll know the path forward.
Now, James Woodall is the former president of Georgia's NAACP and one of the plaintiffs in the federal lawsuit. Here's what he shared with me.
I think as this case plays out before the 11th Circuit and maybe even higher than that, we still have some unresolved questions about what this means for the state of Georgia. And it was my understanding that the elections from the last cycle were postponed because of that lawsuit. And it has now been brought to my attention that that includes this election cycle as well. So I don't believe there's nefarious actions on part of the Secretary of State or anything like that. But I do think there is something to be said about this kind of being at pause for as long as it has been. And so I'm concerned for that, and I'm ultimately concerned for what ultimately constitutes our democracy.
Now, here's the bottom line. The commissioners who were supposed to run in 2022, Eccles and Johnson, along with Republican Tricia Pridemore, who's supposed to run this year, they're going to continue serving on the commission without having to run for re-election.
This is kind of an important drama that I think most people in the state do not know about, but we are glad to know that you are following, as well as our climate and environment team here at WABE will continue to keep tabs on this. All right, let's leave elections behind for a moment. The House passed the fiscal year 2025 budget this week. Rahul, you're our resident budget guru. Remind us when that budget kicks in and maybe give me some highlights.
So this is the budget that will start on July the 1st. That's Georgia's fiscal year, July 1st to June the 30th. Governor Brian Kemp made his proposal back in January, included $2,500 pay raise for public school teachers and staff, while state employees and university system of Georgia employees got a 4% raise. Now, the next major step on that $36 billion budget was legislative hearings, bringing us to this week. Now, while state lawmakers cannot add money to what the governor proposed, they can change where the money goes. And the House rolled out its changes this week and then approved them in the full House. So here are some of those changes. For example, more money for professional licensing at the Georgia Secretary of State's office. Look, there's a lot of attention on the Secretary's office for elections, and rightfully so. But that office also has a role in licensing. For example, veterinarians, barbers, building contractors. And you know what? Lawmakers here have been hearing from those people about licensing issues.
Anything else interesting that cropped up in budget talks this week?
You know, kind of a bigger picture thing that I found interesting. During his budget presentation, House Appropriations Committee Chairman Matt Hatchett had this to say.
Adjusting provider rates periodically helps ensure an adequate network of healthcare providers. The House has funded a number of provider rate increases and looks to the Senate to help fully fund these adjustments.
And I want to give a personal example about this conversation on healthcare. My older son had developmental issues as an infant when we were still a military family. And we were placed in this program called Babies Can't Wait. And it helped us get access to all sorts of therapies that he needed. Now, those services are simply not available if the state or even private insurance doesn't pay high enough rates. And so in this year's budget, you see more money for speech therapy, physical therapy, and more. And while Drew and I are now on private insurance since she left the military, I think our listeners need to understand that especially in more rural areas and even some outer suburban areas, you have to have a certain number of patients for some specialties. And that has to be a combination of well-funded state funding, private insurance funded, and even out of pocket to make that work. So from here, the 2025 state budget goes to the Senate, where they've actually already started hearings.
And this is something we hear a lot in the context of the conversation about Medicaid expansion and hospital closures in rural areas. Rahul, before we go, something I also want to note that we're tracking are these continuing efforts to push through bills related to immigration policy. This week, Republican lawmakers in the Senate took a bill originally related to motor vehicles, stripped out the language, and inserted in a very controversial measure. HB 301 would now allow anyone to sue their local government for not fully coordinating with federal immigration authorities, and the remedy could be stripping all of their state funding except for things like emergency response. This is an example of using a vehicle, both literally and figuratively. This bill was originally about motor vehicles, to get around that crossover day deadline. Now, this change was not flagged anywhere publicly before the committee meeting. Democrats were blindsided by it, and there was no real opportunity for the public to come in and comment on it. So this is something we'll continue to follow. It's not certain to become law yet, but we will keep tracking it.
Sam, I want to mention two quick things on House Bill 301. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the reaction of the county and local governments and their lobbyists up here of what this could mean for those governments. And the other interesting law that kicks in here, the law of unintended consequences, something I'm definitely going to be watching as this bill moves forward.
And Rahul, before we go, you wanted to talk about a dynamic here at the state capitol that you think about a lot, and that is the state House of Representatives versus the state Senate.
You know, Sam, we talk so much about Republican versus Democrat, rural versus urban versus suburban. Sometimes we talk about the divides within the parties themselves, but I really want to remind folks that there's this dynamic between the House and the Senate, which sometimes can kill legislation, whether they're personal battles between the bodies or between the caucuses themselves. And Monday, we saw a flash of it from Republican Senate Majority Leader Steve Gooch.
The Senate passed 67 House bills through March 1st. The House has only passed 26 Senate bills. What have they been doing? I can't ask the question, but thank you, Senator. The Senate, on the other hand, has passed 139 Senate bills, and the House has passed 280 House bills. So the House is outpacing us 280 to 125. So there's a lot of work for us to do.
Look, whether it's priorities, the raw number of bills, or just plain politics, there's going to be some legislation that doesn't make it because of this House-Senate dynamic. You saw that with mental health care reform last year, and I'm already starting to see it with one health care bill and one housing bill. So definitely a dynamic that I'm watching here at the state capitol.
And that's it for this week. Gold Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers, and our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
And you can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast Podcast. And check out wabe.org/Under the Gold Dome. We'll see you next week.
Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
Hey y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at wabe.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
WABE.